posted last week. I'm going to get them up this week, and I will also post today's notes and assignments. So because of that, I won't post anything on Thursday for you. Let's get started though. Membrane potential. So neurons are like most cells. They have a resting membrane potential. The big difference between neurons, which makes them very similar to muscle cells, is that they can rapidly change their resting membrane potential. For that reason, we refer to neurons and other cells like them as being highly excitable. So again, opposite charges attract each other. We know that from physics. We know that from just knowing it. And if we want to keep charges apart, it's going to require energy. If you don't let them go together, you have to use energy to keep them apart. But the other side of that coin is that when you do let them move towards one another, you release energy, so we can use that energy. So when opposite charges are in a separated situation, as they are in the case of cells on the other side of the membrane, we have potential energy. So we need some definitions to go through. Just hopefully this is review. Voltage is a potential energy. It's generated because charges are separated. It's measured between 2 points. If we were talking a full volt, it would be quite a bit of energy. If we were talking electricity, we might be using volts. But for cells, we're using millivolts. And we can also refer to it as a potential difference or potential. So a charge difference across the plasma membrane results in potential. The greater that charge difference between the 2 points, the higher the voltage. Current is the flow of electrical charges, and in this case we're talking about the movement of ions between 2 points. We're talking about the movement of ions across the cell membrane in neurons. And we can use that energy to do work. That flow is going to be influenced by, dependent upon the voltage, the potential difference, and the resistance. The resistance is a hindrance to charge flows. So we can divide things into two big groups, either insulators, which have a high amount of resistance, or conductors, which have a low amount of resistance. The law that covers this, the law in physics that covers this, is called Ohm's law. It gives a relationship. Current is equal to the voltage divided by the resistance, which means that current is going to be directly proportional to the voltage. The more voltage you have, the more potential, the greater the current you can go. There's no net flow between 2 points with the same potential. And on the other hand, current is inversely related to the resistance. So the greater the resistance, the harder it is to get flow, the smaller the current will be. So let's apply those to membranes, neuron membranes in this case. So large proteins are going to be selective membrane ion channels. We have potassium ion channels that only allow potassium through. There are two major types of ion channels: those that are non-gated or leakage channels that are always open, and gated channels, which in part, when they are activated because something binds to them, they change shape and they open or close to the channel. There are three kinds of gated channels. They can be gated chemically, they can be gated by voltage, or they can be mechanically gated. So if they are chemically gated channels, then something binds to them. Usually we'll call it a ligand, often a protein. Usually what we'll be talking about in this case is neurotransmitters. Voltage-gated channels change shape in response to changes in that membrane potential. And mechanically gated channels change in response to the physical deformation of the receptors. So touch receptors, when you touch something, you're deforming that protein, and that changes the gating. It lets ions in. Here they are outlined, and I would recommend you go to figure 11.7 in your text and check that out. So when gated channels are open, the ions diffuse quickly. They move under two forces, chemical concentration gradients, so they're going to move from high concentration to low concentration, that drives them, as well as electrical gradients, so they'll move towards opposite charges. So that gives us what we will refer to as an electrochemical gradient, combining those two. So if we again look at Ohm's law, ions flow, create an electrical current, and voltage changes across the membrane. So we can rearrange Ohm's law. V equals IR. The voltage is equal to the current times the resistance. And we can use a machine called the voltmeter to find that measure that resting membrane potential, So the resting membrane potential is approximately minus 70 millivolts. Cytoplasmic side of the membrane is negatively charged relative to the outside. The actual voltage can vary between minus 40 and minus 90, but when a cell is in this state, average minus 70, we say it is polarized. That potential is generated by differences in the ionic concentrations of sodium and potassium in the intracellular and extracellular fluid, and is also generated by differences in permeability of the membrane to those two ions, especially those two ions. So if we put our voltmeter in there, we would get a measurement of minus 70 millivolts. As far as the ionic concentrations, the extracellular has more sodium than the intracellular. That's balanced by chlorine ions. The intracellular has more potassium than the extracellular, and that's balanced out by the negatively charged proteins. And potassium is going to play the most important role in membrane potential.
The human brain alone contains about 100 billion nerve cells called neurons. A neuron, like all cells, has negatively and positively charged ions in the fluids located both inside and outside of the cell. However, the ionic composition of these two fluids is markedly different. The inner surface of the membrane is negatively charged, while the outer surface is positively charged. This unequal distribution of charge creates a voltage across the plasma membrane, known as the membrane potential. In a resting, unstimulated neuron, this membrane potential is known specifically as the resting membrane potential. The value of the resting membrane potential depends on two factors. The first is the presence of concentration gradients across the plasma membrane, especially those gradients for sodium and potassium ions. The second is the permeability of the plasma membrane to sodium and potassium. In the resting state, this permeability depends on the number of non-gated leak channels present in the membrane for these ions. The magnitude of the resting membrane potential, inside relative to outside, is measured in millivolts using a voltmeter and two electrodes. We'll now place both electrodes in the extracellular fluid. Note that the voltmeter records 0 voltage. This is because the unequal distribution of charge exists only across the plasma membrane. The intra and extracellular fluids are otherwise electrically neutral. However, when we insert one of the electrodes into the intracellular fluid, a voltage is recorded. The value of the resting membrane potential varies, but on average it is minus 70 millivolts.
Okay, so we get that resting membrane potential because of the difference in potassium and sodium concentrations inside and outside of the cell, as well as the difference in permeability between those two ions. So let's look more closely at those things. So the cell membrane is impermeable to large anionic proteins. So most proteins have a negative charge. Proteins do not freely cross the membrane. The membrane is slightly permeable to sodium. There are leakage channels for sodium, and sodium diffuses down its concentration gradient, so it's more outside the cell than in. It will tend to diffuse into the cell. But the cell membrane is 25 times more permeable to potassium than sodium because there are more of these leakage channels. Potassium also moves down its concentration gradient, so it tends to move out of the cell. And the membrane is permeable to chlorine ions. So more potassium is going to diffuse out than sodium diffuses in, and as a result, the inside of the cell is going to be more negative than the outside of the cell. That's our resting membrane potential. That's approximately, or on average, minus 70 millivolts different. The sodium-potassium pump, the sodium-potassium ATPase, is really important in stabilizing this membrane potential. It helps to maintain the concentrations of sodium and potassium. Remember that 3 sodiums are pumped out while 2 sodiums are pumped back in this sodium-potassium ATPase. And that's, you can walk through that on figure 11.1. So if we change the resting membrane potential, we can either change concentrations of ions across the membrane or change permeability to those ions. We can get 2 types of signals that can happen: a graded potential and an action potential. Graded potentials are over short distances. They are signals from other cells. Excuse me. Whereas action potentials will continue over long distances, and they will move down the length of an axon. And changes in membrane potential are going to be used as our signals that are receiving, integrating, and sending information by neurons. So we're talking about depolarization, which is a decrease in membrane potential, moving towards 0 and above, which means the inside becomes less negative than the resting membrane potential. And that is going to increase the probability that an impulse will occur. And we can also have hyperpolarization. Here we're going to increase the membrane potential. We're going to move it away from 0. Instead of minus 70, it'll be more negative. And that's going to decrease the probability that that cell will fire. So we can have depolarizing stimuli from one nerve to another, which will make it less likely that the postsynaptic neuron will fire, or we can have make it more likely. And hyperpolarizing stimuli would, from one neuron to the next neuron, the postsynaptic neuron, would be less likely to fire. So let's start with these graded potentials. Graded potentials are short, localized changes in membrane potential. The stronger the stimulus we get, the more voltage changes, and the further the current will flow from there. Eventually, it may become an action potential. They're going to be triggered by stimuli that open gated ion channels. So that's going to depolarize in many cases that we looked at before. We saw it in muscle cells, but in nerve cells, it could also hyperpolarize, make it less likely. These types of graded potentials will be named according to their location and function. Receptor potentials are generator potentials. They're graded potentials and receptors of sensory neurons. And postsynaptic potentials are neuron graded potentials. So here we have a graded potential. We depolarize a small region of the membrane, and it dissipates quickly. Once the gated channels open, depolarization spreads from one area of the membrane to the next. So it will propagate from that graded potential a ways on either side. But the current's going to dissipate quickly and decay as well. So graded potentials are signals only over very short distances. An action potential, on the other hand, is going to be the principal way that neurons send signals. This is a means of long-distance neural communication. Long distance means generally from the axon hillock to the axon terminal. It's going to occur in muscle cells we've already looked at, and it occurs again in the axons of neurons. There's a brief reversal of membrane potential with a change of voltage of approximately 100 millivolts. Action potentials, unlike graded potentials, don't decay over distance. And in neurons, we would refer to these as the nerve impulse. So when one nerve sends an impulse to another nerve or to a target organ, it is one of these action potentials. It's going to involve specific voltage-gated channels. There are four main steps to this process. In the resting state, all the gated sodium and potassium channels are closed. The leakage channels are open for both sodium and potassium that we talked about before. That maintains our resting membrane potential. Each sodium channel has two voltage-sensitive gates. There's an action gate and an inactivation gate. Activation gates are closed at rest, and they will open as depolarization begins, and that will allow sodium to enter the cell. Inactivation gates are open at rest. They block the channel once it's open to prevent more sodium from entering the cell. So each potassium channel has a voltage-sensitive gate, which is closed at rest and opens, but only slowly as depolarization occurs. Second step, depolarization occurs when sodium channels open. Depolarization of local currents opens voltage-gated sodium channels, and sodium will begin to rush into the cell, moving down both its concentration and electrical gradient. Sodium activation and inactivation gates open. The sodium influx is going to cause more depolarization, which opens more sodium channels. As a result of that, the intracellular fluid becomes less negative. When we reach a threshold of approximately minus 50 millivolts, so between minus 55 and minus 50 millivolts, we induce a positive feedback mechanism that causes the opening of all sodium channels, which gives us a large spike in our action potential. The membrane polarity can go from minus 70 up to plus 30 millivolts. Then we need to reset things. So third step is repolarization. The sodium channels are inactivating and the potassium channels begin to open. So sodium channels inactivation gates close, the membrane permeability to sodium declines to the resting state, and our action potential spike is going to stop rising. Then the voltage-gated potassium channels will open, and potassium will exit the cell down its concentration and electrical gradient. And that will repolarize the cell but this time it's because potassium has left, not because we pumped the sodium back out. So in step number 4, we get some hyperpolarization. As some of the potassium channels remain open and some of the sodium channels reset, we still allowing excessive outflow of potassium ions, and that means the inside of the membrane is going to become more negative than in the resting state, more than minus 70. That hyperpolarization, a slight dip below resting voltage, helps keep the signal moving in just one direction, and it also begins to reset the sodium channels.
Neurons communicate over long distances by generating and sending electrical signals called action potentials. Most action potentials originate in the axon's initial segment, a region also called the trigger zone. During an action potential, voltage-gated sodium and potassium channels open and close, thus altering the membrane's permeability to sodium and potassium ions. As these ions diffuse through the channels, the membrane potential changes. It depolarizes from the resting state of minus 70 millivolts to a peak value of plus 30 millivolts, and then quickly repolarizes back to minus 70 millivolts after a brief period of hyperpolarization. In this topic, we explore, step by step, the events that occur as an action potential is generated in the axon's initial segment.
So, to generate the action potential, repolarization will reset the electrical conditions, but doesn't reset the ionic conditions. Remember, the potassium has moved out. We haven't put sodium potassium back on the right side of the membrane. So with our sodium potassium pump, there are thousands of them in an axon. We are going to work to restore that ionic condition. So our sodium, this is an all or nothing phenomenon. Not all depolarization events, not all graded potentials will lead to action potentials. For an axon to fire, the depolarization has to reach that threshold. At that threshold, which we said was around minus 55 to 50 millivolts, the membrane potential the sodium permeability will increase. Sodium will come in and potassium will go out, but more sodium comes in than potassium goes out. And that triggers the positive feedback cycle, and that positive feedback cycle makes this an all or nothing phenomenon. Action potentials will either happen completely or they will not happen at all. So you can't send a signal halfway down an axon. That propagation allows the action potential to be transmitted from where it originates down the entire axon length towards the terminals. So sodium influx through voltage-gated channels in one membrane area causes local currents that cause opening of sodium voltage-gated in adjacent areas. That leads to polarization of that area, which in turn causes depolarization in the next area. So once it's initiated, an action potential can be thought of as self-propagating. And this is where myelination in nerves becomes important. In non-myelinated axons, each successive segment of the membrane has to depolarize and then repolarize. In myelinated axons, it's different. We can jump from node to node. So the sodium channels are closer to the action potential, are still inactivated. No new action potential is generated there. Bottom line, this is a one-directional movement. It moves down the axon. I should start, I believe. No, I think we lost the audio. Let's start that again.
Action potentials propagate in a continuous fashion in unmyelinated axons. Once an action potential is generated in the initial segment of the axon, it propagates the entire length of the axon. Recall that a threshold stimulus causes voltage-gated sodium channels to open. The influx of sodium ions generates an action potential. It also establishes a depolarizing current that flows to the next segment and brings it to threshold. Voltage-gated sodium channels open, regenerating the action potential in this segment of the axon. Current flows from this segment and depolarizes the next segment to threshold, thus regenerating the action potential yet again. In this way, regeneration continues in one direction all the way down to the axon terminals. The basis for unidirectional propagation is revealed when we take a closer look. By the end of the depolarization phase of the action potential, all voltage-gated sodium channels inactivate and voltage-gated potassium channels open. These two events render this segment of the axon temporarily insensitive or refractory to another depolarizing stimulus. However, voltage-gated sodium channels in the downstream segment are closed and receptive to a depolarizing stimulus. Thus, propagation occurs sequentially down the axon to the axon terminals. In myelinated axons, action potential propagation is a bit different. Here they propagate in a saltatory or leaping fashion. The myelin sheath consists of multiple layers of tightly wrapped glial cell membrane. But this sheath is not a continuous one. Exposed areas of axonal membrane, known as nodes of Ranvier, occur at discrete intervals. Voltage-gated sodium channels are abundant in the nodes, but largely absent between nodes. So, action potentials are regenerated at each node, not in areas covered by the myelin sheath. However, the myelin sheath does provide the insulation necessary for the rapid spread of depolarizing current. And the sooner the nodes reach threshold, the faster action potentials propagate along the axon. Saltatory conduction is extremely fast. Velocities often exceed 100 meters per second. In contrast, continuous conduction is fairly slow. Velocities rarely exceed 2 meters per second. Nevertheless, both continuous and saltatory conduction propagate action potentials over varying distances because action potentials regenerate along the way. Summary: propagation of an action potential. Once generated, the action potential propagates the entire length of the axon without decrement.
Okay. Now we can move on. So, stimulus intensity. All the action potentials are alike. They're independent of the stimulus intensity. So we have different ways of determining weak stimuli versus strong stimuli. One of the ways is frequency of impulses, a frequency of the number of impulses received per second. We would interpret higher frequencies, meaning stronger stimuli. That refractory period, again, is important. That's when the neuron can't trigger another action potential because voltage-gated sodium channels are open, so the neuron can't respond to another stimulus. There are two kinds of this refractory period. First is the absolute refractory period, in which the time from opening the sodium channels until we reset the channels ensures that it's an action potential is an all or nothing event, and it also enforces the one-way transmission. The relative refractory period is after that, and that's when most sodium channels have returned to their resting state, but potassium channels are still open. This is the time when we're doing our repolarization. We've electrically reset the system, but we need to ionically reset the system. And this is, during this time, the threshold for action potential is elevated. They are hyperpolarized. So it would take an exceptionally strong stimulus to get an action potential. Think of a disobedient or refractory dog. If he's absolutely refractory, he will never come when called. But if he's relatively refractory, he may come, but only if you call him loud enough. I guess that's a decent analogy. Velocities, touched on in the video. Action potentials occur in axons and on other parts of the cell. Action potential, conduction velocities vary. They vary based on the diameter of the axon and how much myelination there is. Large diameter fibers have less resistance to local current flow, so they have faster impulse. Myelination gives us our continuous or saltatory conduction. So that continuous conduction is slower because you have to move down every micron of the length of the axon, whereas the saltatory conduction occurs at the gaps, so you're kind of jumping, can be 30 times faster. So it's because those myelin sheaths insulate and prevent leakage of charge, because voltage-gated channels are open and located in the myelin gaps. The action potentials are only generated at the gap, so it appears to jump rapidly from gap to gap. Multiple sclerosis is an autoimmune disease that primarily affects young adults. The myelin sheaths in the central nervous system are destroyed when the immune system attacks the myelin. The myelin turns into hardened lesions that are called scleroses, so multiple scleroses. That's going to slow the impulse conduction and eventually may cause it to stop. Demyelination axon increases the sodium channels. It causes the cycles of relapse and remission that are characteristic of multiple sclerosis. The optic nerve is often a target for multiple sclerosis, more commonly, or at least in the people that I know that have multiple sclerosis, weakness of their muscles, loss of muscle control, which would include speech muscles and incontinence. There are drugs that help to modify the immune system activity. There are a number of new drugs in clinical trials that are showing some promise. Ultimately, we don't know the causes of multiple sclerosis. I think the Epstein-Barr virus has been recently implicated as possibly playing a role, some new research. And while we currently can't prevent it, at least we don't know how, vitamin D levels may help reduce the risk of development. So conduction velocities continuing, nerve fibers are classified by diameter, degree of myelination, or speed of conduction. Using these criteria, we get three groups of nerve fibers. Group A fibers are the largest diameter. They're myelinated somatic sensory and motor fibers of the skin, skeletal muscle, and joints. Their signals move at about 300 miles per hour or 150 meters per second. Group B fibers are intermediate in diameter. They are lightly myelinated. They transmit signals at 30 miles per hour or 15 meters per second. And group C fibers are the smallest in diameter. They are unmyelinated and they transmit signals at about 2 miles per hour or 1 meter per second. B and C groups include the autonomic nervous system, visceral, motor, and sensory fibers to serve visceral organs, which we will be seeing when we talk about the autonomic nervous system. Impaired action potential impulse propagation can be caused by a number of chemical and physical factors. Local anesthetics block voltage-gated sodium channels, cold temperatures, continuous pressure, interrupt blood circulation, the delivery of oxygen to neurons. So if your foot goes to sleep or your fingers get numb, that's probably that. All right, that wraps up this part of the chapter. I've got one more for chapter 11.